He thought humiliating her would be easy, but in less than 10 minutes, that courtroom would witness the quiet collapse of his own authority. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe dignity should never be judged by appearance, make sure to like and subscribe. Now, back to Claire Whitman. The courtroom in downtown Boston carried the weight of polished oak and quiet judgment, sunlight filtering through tall windows and stretching across the marble floor in long golden lines. Judge Daniel Brooks sat high above it all, his black robe perfectly pressed, his expression carved from years of unchecked authority. He had seen thousands pass through his courtroom, and in his mind, he could read people within seconds. And today, as Claire Whitman stood quietly at the defense table in a simple navy cardigan and modest flats, he believed he had her figured out completely. Just another unprepared woman, he thought. Just another interruption to his schedule. A faint smirk tugged at the corner of his lips as he adjusted his glasses and glanced down at her file, barely skimming it. Around the room, a few attorneys exchanged knowing looks, their subtle smiles reflecting the same assumption. Claire stood still, hands resting lightly on a worn folder, her posture calm but unremarkable, as if she didn't belong in a place like this. The air carried a low murmur, the quiet rustle of papers, the occasional cough echoing against the high ceiling. Then came the moment. Judge Brooks leaned forward, his voice cutting clean through the room with deliberate sharpness. "Ms. Whitman," he began, his tone laced with controlled condescension. "I trust you understand that this is a court of law, not a place for unprepared individuals to waste our time." A few faint chuckles rippled through the benches behind her, quickly stifled but unmistakable. Claire didn't respond. She didn't flinch. She simply lifted her eyes toward the bench, steady, unreadable. The judge mistook that silence for uncertainty, for weakness. He continued, more boldly now. "Do you even have proper legal representation today, or are you planning to improvise?" The word hung in the air like a quiet insult. Someone in the back shifted in their seat. A pin dropped. The room seemed to lean in, waiting. Claire's fingers tightened slightly around the edge of her folder, but her face remained composed, almost distant, as though she were listening to something far beyond the judge's voice. From the gallery, a young clerk whispered to another, barely audible, "This is going to be rough." Judge Brooks leaned back, satisfied, already preparing to move on, already certain of how this would end. In his mind, the outcome was written. The humiliation had begun, and he believed it would unfold exactly as he intended. But there was something he didn't notice. Not the way Claire's breathing slowed, not the way her shoulders settled into stillness, and certainly not the quiet clarity in her eyes. Because while the room saw a simple woman standing alone, what they failed to see was someone who had already understood every move before it was made. And for the first time that morning, beneath the polished authority and rehearsed confidence, the balance of power had already begun to shift, even if no one else in that courtroom realized it yet. The faint echo of the judge's words still lingered in the air, but the room had begun to shift in a way that was almost imperceptible, like the quiet tension before a storm that no one could yet see forming. Claire Whitman remained standing at the defense table, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but there was a subtle difference now, something steadier, something grounded. Judge Brooks, however, did not notice it. He flipped through the thin file in front of him with casual disinterest, the pages making a dry, dismissive sound as they turned. "Let us move this along," he said, his tone clipped, impatient. "Ms. Whitman, since you appear to be representing yourself, I will keep this simple." Another pause, calculated, almost theatrical. "Do you understand the procedural expectations of this court?" A few heads in the gallery tilted slightly, watching her more closely now. Claire inhaled slowly, the kind of breath that did not draw attention but seemed to anchor her in place. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, her voice soft but clear, carrying farther than expected in the quiet room. The judge raised an eyebrow, faint amusement flickering across his face. "Is that so?" he said. "Because from where I am sitting, you do not appear to have filed the appropriate preliminary motion, nor have you submitted any formal argument for consideration." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. "Would you care to explain that?" The question was not an invitation. It was a trap, carefully laid and confidently sprung. A few attorneys exchanged glances again, some already anticipating the awkward silence that would follow. But it did not come. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, opening the worn folder she had been holding since the beginning. The paper inside was neatly arranged, edges aligned with quiet precision. She ran her fingers along the top sheet, not nervously, but deliberately, as if confirming something she already knew. Then she looked up again. "Your Honor," she said, her tone unchanged. "The preliminary motion was submitted electronically at 9:12 this morning, in accordance with Rule 5.3 of the Massachusetts Civil Procedure Code." The room did not react immediately. For a second, the words seemed to hang, unclaimed, as if no one had expected them to exist. Judge Brooks blinked once, the smallest interruption in his composure. "That is not reflected in the file before me," he replied quickly, though his voice had lost a fraction of its earlier certainty. Claire gave a slight nod, not defensive, not confrontational. "It would not be, Your Honor," she said, "because it was filed as a supplemental motion under expedited review, which places it in the digital docket rather than the printed summary." A clerk near the side of the room straightened suddenly, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Someone shifted in their seat. The air changed, just slightly. Judge Brooks turned his head, glancing toward the clerk, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Verify that," he said sharply. The sound of typing filled the silence that followed, quick, precise keystrokes echoing louder than they should have. Claire did not move. She did not speak. She simply stood, her hands resting lightly on the folder once more, her eyes steady. And for the first time since the hearing began, the certainty that had filled the room began to crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for those paying attention to feel it. Because what had just happened was not luck, and it was not coincidence. It was preparation. And somewhere beneath the polished authority of the bench, a quiet realization had begun to form, even if Judge Brooks was not ready to admit it yet. The room did not laugh this time. The room waited. The soft clatter of the clerk's keyboard seemed louder now, each keystroke echoing across the courtroom like a countdown no one had agreed to witness. Judge Brooks remained still, but his fingers pressed slightly tighter against the edge of the bench, a subtle tension betraying the confidence he had carried just moments before. He did not look at Claire immediately. Instead, he watched the clerk, waiting, expecting correction, expecting confirmation that this disruption would resolve in his favor. "Your Honor," the clerk finally said, voice careful, almost hesitant, "there is a supplemental filing timestamped at 9:12 this morning under expedited review, submitted by Ms. Claire Whitman." The words settled heavily into the room. A quiet shift followed, not dramatic, but unmistakable. One attorney leaned forward. Another adjusted his glasses. The earlier smirks had vanished, replaced by something quieter, something more attentive. Judge Brooks turned his gaze back to Claire, slower this time. His expression did not crack, but it tightened, recalibrating. "I see," he said, his tone measured, though the edge had dulled. "That still does not explain why it was not brought to the court's attention directly. It was an attempt to recover ground, to reassert control." Claire inclined her head slightly, her voice steady. "Your Honor, Rule 5.3 subsection B specifies that supplemental filings under expedited review are to be considered automatically entered into the record without verbal notice, unless the court requests clarification." She did not rush the words. She did not emphasize them. She simply placed them into the room with quiet precision. The silence that followed was different now. It was no longer anticipation of failure. It was recognition of something unfolding. Judge Brooks leaned back, exhaling through his nose, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied her. For the first time, he was not looking at her clothing, or her posture, or the simplicity he had judged so quickly. He was looking for something else, something he had missed. "You seem unusually familiar with procedural detail," he said, choosing his words more carefully now. "For someone without formal representation." A faint murmur rippled again, but softer this time, more uncertain. Claire's hands remained still against the folder. Her gaze did not waver. "Understanding procedure is essential when navigating the court system, Your Honor," she replied. "Representation does not replace responsibility." A pause. Not defiant, not submissive, just complete. The judge held her gaze a moment longer, then glanced down again at the file, flipping a page. More deliberately this time. The casual dismissal from earlier had disappeared. Each movement now carried weight. Each second stretched slightly longer. Somewhere in the gallery, a man cleared his throat. Another shifted in his seat. The atmosphere had changed in a way no one could reverse. Judge Brooks tapped his pen once against the bench, a quiet, controlled motion. "Very well," he said. "Let us proceed." But the words did not carry the same authority they had before, because something had already slipped. Not loudly, not visibly, but enough. Claire stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in tone, yet the space around her felt different now, as if the room itself had adjusted to her presence. And while the judge continued to speak, outlining the next steps with careful formality, there was a growing awareness, subtle but undeniable, spreading through the courtroom. This was no longer a simple case. This was no longer a predictable outcome. And for the first time since the hearing began, the person who believed he controlled the room was no longer the only one being watched. The room had gone quiet again. But this time, it was not waiting for her to fail. It was waiting to see what she would do next. Judge Brooks adjusted his posture slightly. The subtle shift almost imperceptible, yet it carried a different weight now, as though the rhythm of the courtroom had slipped just enough to unsettle him. He glanced again at the digital docket displayed on the monitor beside the clerk, confirming what he already knew but had not expected to confront so early. Then he straightened, reclaiming his tone, though it no longer carried the same effortless dominance. "Ms. Whitman," he began, slower this time, more deliberate, "since you appear confident in your understanding of procedure, let us address the substance of your filing." His voice echoed across the room, but the echo felt thinner, less commanding. Claire did not move immediately. She allowed a brief pause, not as hesitation, but as control, as if she were choosing the exact moment to step forward. When she did speak, her voice remained calm, evenly paced. "Yes, Your Honor." He leaned forward again, pen resting lightly between his fingers. "Your supplemental motion challenges the admissibility of the opposing claim based on procedural inconsistency," he said, reading from the screen now rather than the printed file. That is a significant assertion for someone without formal counsel. The statement was neutral on the surface, but beneath it lingered a familiar doubt, quieter now, but still present. Claire opened her folder once more, sliding a single document forward with careful precision. The paper made a soft sound against the polished surface of the table. "The inconsistency is not interpretive, Your Honor," she said. "It is structural." A faint murmur stirred again in the gallery, quickly fading as attention sharpened. Judge Brooks tapped his pen once, eyes narrowing slightly. "Explain." The word landed heavier than before, not as a command, but as a test he was no longer entirely certain of winning. Claire glanced down briefly at the document, then back up. "The original claim references a filing submitted on March 3rd at 2:45 in the afternoon," she said, her tone steady. "However, the official docket reflects that no such filing exists at that time. Instead, there is a corrected submission logged at 3:18, which alters the sequence of events required to establish jurisdiction." The courtroom held still. The explanation was not rushed. It unfolded with quiet clarity, each detail placed exactly where it needed to be. Judge Brooks shifted slightly, his gaze moving quickly between the screen and the document in her hand. "Clerical errors occur," he said, though the certainty in his voice had softened further. Claire gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yes, Your Honor, they do. But jurisdiction does not." The words settled into the room with a weight that could not be dismissed. No one spoke. No one moved. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked faintly as someone adjusted their posture, but the sound seemed distant, irrelevant. Judge Brooks exhaled slowly, setting the pen down with more care than before. His eyes lifted again to meet hers, and for the first time, there was no trace of amusement left. Only focus, only calculation. He turned slightly toward the clerk. "Pull the March 3rd docket entries," he said, his voice controlled, quieter now. The clerk nodded immediately, fingers returning to the keyboard, the sound of typing filling the silence once again. Claire remained exactly where she stood, her presence no longer blending into the background, no longer overlooked. The room had adjusted to her, or perhaps it had finally begun to see her. And as the seconds passed, as the verification unfolded in real time, a realization began to take shape, subtle but undeniable. This was no longer a matter of correcting a simple misunderstanding. This was a shift in control. And while Judge Brooks maintained his composure, while his posture remained upright and his expression measured, something deeper had already begun to change. Because the assumptions he had made at the beginning of the hearing were no longer holding. And in their place, something far more dangerous was emerging. Uncertainty. The room went quiet again, but this time, it was not just watching. It was learning. The faint glow of the monitor reflected against Judge Brooks's glasses as the clerk continued typing, the quiet rhythm of keys now carrying a weight that no one in the room could ignore. Seconds stretched longer than they should have, each one tightening the atmosphere just a little more. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt. Claire Whitman stood still, her presence no longer overlooked, her silence no longer mistaken for uncertainty. She did not look at the clerk. She did not look at the gallery. Her eyes remained steady, directed toward the bench, patient, composed, as if she had already seen how this moment would unfold. "Your Honor," the clerk said at last, her voice careful. "The March 3rd entry at 2:45 does not exist in the system. The earliest filing associated with this claim is timestamped at 3:18 p.m., as Ms. Whitman indicated." The words landed with quiet finality. A subtle shift moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. One attorney leaned back slowly, his expression no longer skeptical. Another lowered his pen, no longer taking casual notes, now fully watching. The earlier confidence that had filled the courtroom had dissolved into something far more attentive. Judge Brooks did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the screen for a moment longer than necessary, as though searching for something that was no longer there. Then he leaned back, placing both hands flat against the bench, grounding himself in the familiar structure of authority. "That suggests a discrepancy," he said, his voice measured, controlled, but stripped of its earlier ease. Claire inclined her head slightly. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied. "And that discrepancy directly affects the validity of the claim's jurisdictional standing." The precision of her words left no space for interpretation, no exaggeration, no hesitation, just clarity. The judge's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He turned his attention back to her fully now, no longer dividing it between paperwork and assumption. "You are asserting that the claim should be dismissed on procedural grounds alone," he said. It was not a question. It was an attempt to reframe, to regain direction. Claire's hands rested lightly against the folder once more. "I am asserting that the claim cannot proceed because it does not meet the procedural requirements necessary to be heard by this court," she said. A pause followed, the kind that carried weight, the kind that could not be filled with dismissal. The room held still again. Even the ambient sounds of movement seemed to fade, as if the space itself had chosen to listen. Judge Brooks reached for his pen again, then stopped, his fingers hovering just above it before withdrawing. A small gesture, but one that did not go unnoticed by those paying attention. "And you believe this oversight invalidates the entirety of the opposing argument," he said, his tone quieter now, less declarative. Claire did not rush her answer. "It does not invalidate the argument, Your Honor," she said calmly. "It prevents it from being properly considered under the law." The distinction was precise, surgical, the kind that left no room for easy dismissal. A faint exhale moved through the gallery, barely audible, yet shared, because what had once felt like a routine hearing had transformed into something else entirely. Something sharper, something real. Judge Brooks shifted again, this time slower, more deliberate, his gaze no longer carrying judgment, but calculation. The balance had changed. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but enough that it could no longer be ignored. He glanced once more at the screen, then back at Claire, and in that brief exchange, something unspoken settled into the room. He was no longer certain, and she had known that would happen all along. The room did not move. It waited, not for her to prove herself anymore, but to see how far she would go. The silence did not break this time. It deepened. It settled into the walls, into the polished wood, into every set of eyes now fixed not on the judge, but on Claire Whitman. Judge Brooks shifted slightly in his chair, a movement so small it would have gone unnoticed earlier, but now it carried meaning. His authority was no longer assumed. It was being measured, carefully, quietly. He cleared his throat, a controlled sound meant to re-establish rhythm. Even if the procedural timing is inconsistent, he said, choosing each word with precision, the court may still consider whether the intent of the filing satisfies the requirements for review. It was a careful pivot, not a denial. Not yet. Claire listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady. When he finished, she allowed a brief pause, just long enough for the weight of his statement to settle before she responded. Intent does not establish jurisdiction, Your Honor, she said calmly. Only compliance does. The words were not louder. They were not sharper, but they landed with unmistakable clarity. A faint shift moved through the gallery again. Someone leaned forward. Another person folded their arms, watching more closely now. The atmosphere had sharpened into something precise, something that demanded attention. Judge Brooks rested his hand against the bench, his fingers tapping once, then stopping. His eyes remained on Claire, studying her, recalculating. You are making a very specific argument for dismissal, he said. One that removes the court's ability to hear the substance of the case entirely. Claire gave a slight nod. I am preserving the integrity of the process, Your Honor, she replied. No hesitation, no embellishment, just the statement, placed exactly where it belonged. The room absorbed it. Slowly, the judge leaned back again, exhaling through his nose, his gaze shifting briefly toward the clerk, then back to the screen, then finally returning to Claire. For the first time, there was no attempt to diminish her. No trace of the earlier condescension remained. Only focus, only the quiet realization that the ground beneath him was no longer stable. If what you are asserting is accurate, he said carefully, then the opposing filing would be procedurally defective. The words felt heavier than anything he had said before. Claire did not move. Yes, Your Honor. Another pause followed. Longer this time. The kind that stretched beyond comfort. The kind that forced acknowledgement. Somewhere in the back row, a man shifted in his seat, the sound of fabric against wood briefly breaking the stillness before fading again. Judge Brooks looked down at the digital docket once more, his eyes scanning the timestamps, the entries, the absence where something should have been. Then he looked back, up, and for a brief moment, just a fraction of a second, something flickered across his face. Not doubt, not exactly, something closer to recognition. Clerk, he said, his voice quieter now, controlled but no longer absolute. Confirm whether the corrected filing at 318 alters the jurisdictional sequence required for this case to proceed. The clerk nodded quickly, already moving, already verifying. The sound of typing returned, steady, deliberate, filling the space once again. Claire remained still, her hands resting lightly against the folder, her presence no longer questioned, no longer underestimated. She did not rush. She did not speak again. She simply waited. Because she understood something the rest of the room was only beginning to realize. This was no longer about proving she belonged here. That question had already been answered. This was about what happened next. And as the seconds passed, as the clerk worked through the verification, as the judge sat in controlled silence, the shift became undeniable. The balance of the room had changed. And this time, everyone could feel it. The steady rhythm of the clerk's typing slowed, then stopped, leaving a silence that felt heavier than anything that had come before. Every sound in the room seemed to withdraw, as if even the air itself had paused to listen. Judge Brooks did not move at first. His posture remained upright, composed, but the stillness around him no longer reinforced his authority. It tested it. Your Honor, the clerk said finally, her voice quieter than before, but unmistakably clear. The corrected filing at 318 changes the sequence required to establish jurisdiction. The original timeline cannot be validated under current procedural standards. The words did not echo. They settled. And in that settling, something shifted irreversibly. A faint exhale moved through the gallery, not dramatic, but collective. A realization, shared without words. Judge Brooks's gaze remained fixed ahead for a moment longer, as if absorbing the statement, as if recalculating every assumption he had made since the hearing began. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair. The movement was controlled, deliberate, but it carried a weight that had not been there before. He was no longer directing the room. He was responding to it. His eyes lifted to Claire Whitman, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal, no shadow of condescension. Only recognition, not of who she appeared to be, but of what she had just done. Ms. Whitman, he said, his voice lower now, steadier. You are asserting that the court does not have proper jurisdiction to hear this case as it currently stands. It was no longer framed as a challenge. It was an acknowledgement. Claire met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, Your Honor. Nothing more. No elaboration. No attempt to emphasize. The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any extended argument could have. The judge's hand moved toward his pen again, but this time he picked it up, turning it slowly between his fingers as he considered the record before him. The digital docket. The timestamps. The absence that could no longer be explained away. Around the room, no one shifted. No one whispered. The earlier energy, the quiet amusement, the subtle dismissals, had vanished completely. What remained was focus, attention, and something else. Respect, forming quietly, without announcement. Judge Brooks exhaled slowly, placing the pen back down with care. His gaze moved briefly across the courtroom, then returned to Claire. The court must operate within the boundaries of procedure, he said, his tone measured, deliberate, each word chosen with precision. And when those boundaries are not met, the court cannot proceed as if they have been. The statement hung in the air, not as a ruling yet, but as something close to it. Claire remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. She did not react. She did not need to. The shift had already occurred. The outcome was no longer being forced. It was unfolding. Judge Brooks straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a different kind of authority, one no longer rooted in assumption, but in acknowledgement. Given the procedural discrepancy confirmed in the record, he continued, the court will need to reassess the viability of this claim before any further proceedings can occur. A pause followed, longer than necessary, intentional, the kind that signaled finality without announcing it outright. No one in the room moved. No one spoke, because everyone understood what had just happened. The woman who had been quietly dismissed at the beginning of the hearing had just redirected the entire course of it. Not through volume, not through confrontation, but through precision, through understanding, through control. And as Judge Brooks sat there, composed yet undeniably altered by the exchange, one truth settled into the room with absolute clarity. He had not lost control in a single moment. He had never truly had it to begin with. And now, everyone could see it. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete. Judge Brooks remained seated, his hands resting lightly against the bench, his posture composed but no longer elevated above the room in the same unquestioned way. The authority was still there, but it had changed. It had narrowed. It had become precise. He looked down once more at the record in front of him, then back at Claire Whitman, and for a brief moment, the entire courtroom seemed to exist in that single exchange of recognition. No one shifted. No one spoke. The weight of what had just occurred settled deeper, anchoring itself into every corner of the space. Ms. Whitman, he said at last, his voice steady, controlled, but stripped of its earlier edge, the court acknowledges the procedural deficiency you have identified. The words were simple, but they carried a finality that could not be softened. A faint movement rippled through the gallery, not a reaction of surprise, but of confirmation. People adjusted in their seats, not out of discomfort, but as if aligning themselves with a reality that had just become clear. Claire inclined her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her composure intact. She did not interrupt. She did not expand. She allowed the moment to remain exactly as it was. Judge Brooks continued, his tone measured, each word placed carefully. Given that the required sequence to establish jurisdiction has not been satisfied, this court cannot proceed with the claim in its current form. A pause followed, longer this time, deliberate, unmistakable. The kind of pause that did not invite response, but marked a conclusion. The room held still. Even the subtle sounds of movement seemed to withdraw entirely. Accordingly, he said, his voice firm but no longer forceful, the claim is dismissed without prejudice, pending proper procedural compliance. The statement settled into the room like a quiet verdict that had been building long before it was spoken. No one reacted immediately. No applause. No audible shock. Just a stillness that carried understanding. Because what had just happened was not dramatic. It was exact. Judge Brooks lowered his gaze briefly, then returned it to Claire, and in that brief moment, something unspoken passed between them. Not apology, not concession, Something quieter. Respect, acknowledged. Without words, Claire did not move right away. She remained standing as she had been from the beginning, her hands resting lightly against the folder, her posture steady. The same woman who had been quietly dismissed at the start of the hearing now stood at the center of its outcome, unchanged in appearance, unchanged in tone, yet entirely redefined in the eyes of everyone present. Around the room, people began to shift slowly, the tension releasing in subtle ways. A pen was picked up, a chair adjusted, a breath exhaled that had been held longer than anyone realized. But no one spoke, because the moment did not need explanation. It did not need reinforcement. Judge Brooks reached for his gavel, then paused for a fraction of a second before bringing it down with a controlled, measured motion. The sound echoed once, clean and final. Court is adjourned. The words carried through the room, but they did not close the moment. They simply acknowledged it. And as people began to rise, as quiet movement returned to the space, one truth remained, lingering in the air long after the sound had faded. The power in that courtroom had not belonged to the loudest voice. It had belonged to the one who understood exactly when to speak. The courtroom did not empty all at once. It unraveled slowly, as if no one wanted to break the quiet too abruptly, as if the moment deserved to linger just a little longer before fading into routine. Papers were gathered with softer movements than before, chairs slid back with care, and conversations, when they returned, did so in hushed tones, restrained and thoughtful. Claire Whitman remained where she was for a few seconds after the gavel's echo had disappeared, her hands still resting lightly against the folder that had never left her side. Nothing about her appearance had changed. The same simple cardigan, the same steady posture. But the way the room regarded her had shifted completely. People who had barely noticed her before now glanced in her direction with quiet curiosity, with something closer to respect. Not exaggerated, not performative, just real. Claire finally closed the folder, the soft sound marking the end of something that had begun long before she stepped into the courtroom that morning. She turned calmly, preparing to leave, her steps measured, unhurried, as if she had never needed to prove anything in the first place. Near the aisle, one of the attorneys who had earlier exchanged amused looks now stood still, watching her pass. He gave a small nod, almost instinctive, as though acknowledging a truth he had not expected to witness. Claire returned the gesture just as simply, then continued on without pause. At the bench, Judge Brooks remained seated even as others began to file out. His hands rested in front of him, fingers loosely interlaced, his gaze no longer fixed on any document, but somewhere beyond the room itself. The authority he carried had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped, refined. He replayed the sequence quietly, not with frustration, but with clarity. The assumption, the dismissal, the correction, and the realization that followed. It had not been loud. It had not been dramatic. It had been precise. And that was what made it undeniable. A clerk approached the bench briefly, speaking in a low voice about scheduling adjustments. But Judge Brooks only nodded faintly, his attention still elsewhere. When he finally rose, the movement was slower, more deliberate, as if the weight he carried had changed in ways no one else could fully see. Across the room, the last few spectators made their way toward the exit, their voices still subdued, their expressions thoughtful. The energy that remained was not one of spectacle, but of quiet reflection. Outside the tall courtroom doors, the hallway stretched wide, filled with the distant sounds of footsteps and conversation, the ordinary rhythm of a courthouse continuing without pause. Claire stepped into that space without hesitation, blending once more into the flow of people, her presence returning to something unremarkable to those who had not been inside. But for those who had witnessed it, the image remained clear. Not of confrontation, not of triumph in the loud sense, but of control, of understanding, of a moment where dignity did not need to be defended with force, only with truth. And back inside the courtroom, where the echoes had finally faded, one quiet realization lingered longer than anything else. Respect was never taken by volume. It was earned in the moments when no one expected it, and remembered long after the room had gone silent.